Well, a year ago, NIL fully came into our lexicon, and that's when Kam Cox came to Illinois as well. And he's kind enough to join us now here on the Illini Inquirer Podcast to talk about how NIL has changed college athletics so far, Kam, how NIL has evolved in that year, and how it will impact college athletics moving forward. So, Kam, thanks as always, man, for bringing insight into what is always an interesting, evolving topic here.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm always glad to be here and glad to be talking with you once again and talking about my favorite topic.
That's right. So before we dive into the last year, you were practicing business law in New York City before you got here. So this is your favorite topic. How did it turn into your favorite topic, and what interested you in this role, and what interested you in working in NIL?
Yeah, so there's a couple things, and folks don't really ask me that question as often as I wish that they did. I'll say for me, it was the opportunity to jump in on something that I thought might be a big deal really early on. I'll say I had a very, very low understanding of NIL when it first started, even as somebody who worked in this space. There were a couple of things that have evolved over the past year that we'll talk about that I could kind of anticipate. I didn't anticipate the intensity and the speed with which that evolution would take place, but I thought that some elements of that would happen. But what I did know was there was a moment of disruption, and the disruption creates opportunity. And so when I had the opportunity to do just this, I said, oh my gosh, this is great. And the best part about it was I was one of the first NIL only folks in the country. And so I knew, well, whatever I do, it's either going to be kind of right or kind of wrong. It can't be like, no, that's totally not the way we do it, because no one's ever done it before. And so that was really, really inspiring. I mean, I'll say that before I came here, I had actually never been to Champaign before. It's a funny story I like to tell, but when I first showed up on my first day, the lady who greeted me at the door, she said, "Did you get here okay?" I said, "Yeah, I'm glad to be here." Speaking of here, right now we're in Champaign. The other one is called Urbana. She said, "It's Urbana. You'll give yourself away." And so I just to give people a picture of how green I really was. I didn't even know how to pronounce Urbana, and now it's someplace I go every day. Went earlier, so that's how it goes. But have been glad to be here, and it's been really, really exciting stuff, and has changed a lot, but has continued to create that opportunity that I had promised in my head.
I was going to bring up with you, you are one of the first NIL coordinators I know that was hired, and Josh seems like he's been very proactive about the NIL space here. So just how would you describe what the University of Illinois, your approach, Josh's approach has been to name, image, and likeness so far?
So our approach really involves three prongs, but all of them we think that we can be at the forefront of. I mean, the first is student athlete education. And so when I first came here, there was this sense that, all right, I need to try to just figure this thing out. We think it's going to affect a lot of different areas of our athletic department, and it has, but the foundation of everything we do is in education. And so that was kind of the start of it. And we had our three educational and pillars of the influence program. I've said it 100 times, I'll say it 101. Brand and strategy development, business innovation, entrepreneurship, and leads to financial literacy. And so we put on programming around that, and that was, I think, well received by our student athletes over the course of this year. We're looking at how to expand that and how to use some of the university resources that we have and some of the great content that we have in order to do that. We'll be kind of announcing more on that here soon. And then the second approach has to do with community outreach. One thing that we realized pretty quickly was we have 550 really good little brand ambassadors that we have the ability to kind of put into the Illinois community. And I say the Illinois community because I mean that both kind of in the physical sense, but also in the virtual sense. I mean, we have second largest living alumni base. And so there's a really big appetite for these little brand ambassadors, and they're good at it, right? These are people who are media trained. These are people who are used to being in the spotlight. These are people who have the ability to get up in front of people. And so we really kind of wanted to release them to do that and to deepen a lot of the important relationships that we have, not just as an institution, but just kind of like as a brand, as a whole. So that stuff is good. And the third part is competitive advantage. I mean, I think for us, one of the reasons we really want to lean into NIL is that we anticipated and saw to be true that having a really good NIL program is one of the best ways in 2022 to make sure that you can establish a competitive advantage in this intense period of disruption for college athletics, where it's so important to do so. When student athletes are thinking about not only attending an institution, but also staying in an institution, as we talk about, the transfer portal and all that stuff. They're looking at, okay, what's my coaching situation look like? They're looking at, okay, how has my academic experience been? They're looking at, what are my facilities like? But now there's this new frontier where they're also looking at, hey, what is the NIL infrastructure? And so we wanted to make sure that we added that component, because we knew the first three were good. Josh has done a great job, and folks did a great job and continue to do a great job on that. But this new thing we knew could potentially be just as important. Turns out it has been on the front. And so we wanted to make sure we did a really good job. And so honestly, folks have really leaned in. I think for us, we have taken a very active approach, understanding, okay, well, these are what our state laws are, these are what the parameters are, and these are also the things that we should consider, because there's all these gray areas. And sometimes you say, well, look, we don't need to get too cute. We might be able to do this, but that's not the way we envision this thing going. We also see ourselves as something of leaders in the space. So there's a value to saying, all right, maybe I can get to yes on this, but maybe I shouldn't. And maybe that there's a value to me not doing that, understanding that folks are looking to us as we kind of move the market on things.
So Kam, I think a year ago when this all happened, and that's why we kind of want to look back and figure out, how has this impacted college athletics? I want to get back to how it's impacted the University of Illinois athletic program, but let's start with the student athletes. I know it's just a 1-year sample size. Maybe this changes in a couple of years, but how has NIL impacted the student athletes you see on a day-to-day basis at Illinois?
I'd say quite a bit. I mean, I think the main way that it's interacted with them and therefore kind of impacted their experience has to be with just their general business awareness. The truth is that, I kind of talked about those 3 pillars earlier. Those are things that our student athlete development team and, general adults have been trying to teach general young folks for a long time. But NIL gives you a real context for that. I'll tell you, I was in the football building yesterday, and I was with a couple of stars in our defense, and they have a new deal. And so they were talking about how much money they were going to make on it. And they were complaining. Jeremy, they said, I thought I was going to make this amount, but I'm here now. I'm only going to make that amount. And I said, that's how taxes work. That's life.
Great education at a university, right?
You want to complain about taxes? Why don't you go ask Coach B about how taxes work? That's what I told him. I was like, he'll tell you even more, right? And it was funny because I said, look, if you guys continue to kind of build your brands off the field, perform well on the field, eventually you're going to be really complaining about taxes at a much higher number. And so, you kind of got to continue to do both of those things in parallel. But that's to say, this isn't new. Right? This isn't it's not as if they just now decided that you're going to be taxed on your compensation. Who knew, right? But what it's done, and it's also not the first time the 2 of them have ever heard about this, I can promise you, right? Because they had jobs in high school and stuff. What it's done is it makes you care. And that's just a small example, and because it happened yesterday, it just hit me, of what I saw. We can get into this, but even last week when I went to the NIL Summit down in Atlanta, kind of a national convention of student athletes and NIL administrators talking about this stuff, was student athletes building their brands. I mean, that's been here for a long time, right? We have a whole creative department that has to do with allowing our student athletes to kind of tell their own stories in the context of our program stories. But now there's an incentive for them to be very deliberate about that. And I think all of that has been very educational for our student athletes. So I'd say that's the main way it's impacted them. I think there's also the piece where they say, hey, I can make a little bit of money. And it's really incentivized them to get out into the community. Like as a student, if you remember back to your student days, by and large, we provide such a great on-campus experience that your world is the campus bubble. With NIL, we knock down that wall and we are encouraging you to, well, maybe you should go a little further down Neal Street than you otherwise would. And it turns out that Green Street's a lot longer than you think. There's other stuff to do. And our student athletes are starting to think, well, maybe I could get a deal with some of those restaurants that are downtown, or, well, maybe there's some folks that I should think about interacting with who are up in Chicago and all that other stuff. And so I think it's just kind of generally increased their awareness, and I've been really proud to be a part of that.
How would you kind of describe, is there, what's the difference? What are the challenges compared to men's athletes, which obviously football, basketball is at a high visibility, Kam, compared to female athletes? How has this impacted female athletes so far compared to men?
I'd say the same way. We were running some numbers yesterday, and it's hard because there's disclosure issues and you never know how correct stuff is. But one thing I was really proud of was that I can confidently say somewhere between 35 and 40% of our NIL activity actually has gone to our female student athletes, which is great. The compensation admittedly is more lopsided, but the number of activities, which is really the source of your education and your experience. The number is the number, but what you're doing and whether you're interacting with it and whether you have reason to care and whether you actually have to read a contract and whether you have to talk to someone who's a business person and whether you just have to think about it, that's really driven by activity. So I'd say the way that our men and women interact with it is similar. I do think that a lot of the national headlines and the national discussion has been dominated by football and men's basketball. And so as a result, I think that our men's basketball and our football student athletes think about NIL a bit more globally, in the sense that they're thinking, okay, what might be the market for my services in a particular context, or not understanding details like, oh, I heard so-and-so was able to earn this amount of money, or, well, so-and-so got a Lamborghini at another school, right? That kind of thing. And I say, well, there's not a Lamborghini dealership around here. So that's going to be a giant hurdle that you have to overcome. So I think that the experience has been largely the same, but I do acknowledge that there's another piece of it for football and men's basketball. And in that sense, I think their awareness has been a little bit greater.
So I want to go back to University of Illinois. Just from my outside observation, Cam, I look at Illinois basketball program that is rolling on the court, and has great talent, has had Io, and Kofi obviously took advantage of NIL the year he was here. But they're starting to seemingly get better talent, and NIL doesn't seem to be an issue for Illinois. While I'm hearing it, some of their competitors, it could be a hindrance. So how has this impacted University of Illinois? Do you feel like you guys are ahead here where you can have it as a competitive advantage?
I do, but that's in flux every day. I mean, I encourage everyone who listens to this to get involved. And whether you say, well, you know what, I own a business and it makes total sense for folks to kind of help my operating activity by, student athletes helping my marketing stuff, great. Or if you're like, I don't, but I'd like to throw $30 toward the effort, there's a means of doing that too. And I say that to say, I do think we have an advantage, but just like everything in college athletics, it's not like you establish an advantage and then Michigan and Michigan State and Indiana and Purdue just say, well, they got us, right? It doesn't work like that. Right. Folks are going to try to catch up on that. And so just like I was the first one in the Big Ten to be hired in just my role, well, now there is somebody who's at Purdue. And now Michigan is starting to lean into it a little bit. And now Ohio State actually has two people who kind of do it, right? And so I say that to say we want to make sure that we can improve everything that we do and build on that. I think one of the things that's been interesting, and I was happy to see that a couple of our transfers who came did comment and say, hey, NIL was a part of what I saw was attractive, is we've been able to present an attractive compensation structure, something where people will say, look, I have the ability to really monetize my NIL in a really cool way there. And they have a system of doing that in a way that just doesn't exist in other places. And I've been excited about that. So I'd say the success of men's basketball has made me a bit busier, but it's definitely a good busy. It's a busy that I want to lean into, and I would like to accelerate.
What's that look like when somebody, a student athlete or recruit, asks you about NIL structure? What does that look like? What can you tell them? What are you allowed to do there?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I can tell them pretty much anything. What you can't do, and one of the big rules, I've never really been worried about it, but I guess other folks cross country have struggled with it, is NIL can't be used as a recruiting inducement. And I think that a lot of times there's this incentive to say, well, if you come here, you'll make this amount of money. We don't have to do that. Reason why is because several of our student athletes are actually making money. So I have the ability to say, well, this is what our current student athletes are making on average, or someone who has played your position has made this amount of money, or yeah, there's been this kind of deal, or yeah, there's been that kind of deal. And I have real examples. I always see it, and I don't mean to be like too damning, but I've always seen kind of the recruiting inducement approach is like a little bit lazy, right? Like it's one thing to say, well, if you come here, you'll make $100,000. That might work with a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old, but it's within the rules, and actually better to say, here we actually do have people who have made $100,000. Like if you actually have that, there's some real value to being able to talk about that. And so I talk about what our current athletes have made. I also talk about what our structures are and how we can offer support. So I talk about my role and my background. I talk about the role that the people on our creative teams play and what that does for it. I talk about the role of the Illini Guardians. I talk about all that stuff. And basically what I'm saying is, look, I'm not going to promise you $1, but if you come here and you maximize this platform, you have the opportunity to make a significant amount of money. And you should believe me because we have folks who have actually done that. And I think that a lot of schools who are more, kind of slower to lean into NIL or behind or for whatever reason, they kind of have to just rely on recruiting inducements because they don't really have any examples. So they just have to say, I promise you, if you come here, you'll make this. And if I'm a recruiter, I'd look across the table and say, well, other than it being against the rules, I just don't believe you. Like, you haven't told me how would that actually happen. We have the ability to kind of talk about that. And I think it's also good because we have the leadership at the top who is beating that drum. I mean, when you have Coach Underwood saying, look, NIL is really important, and here's how you can get involved and who's given his time to that. And when you have Josh Whitman doing the same thing, they can actually believe that. Whereas other schools, people may say, oh, well, we care about NIL. Well, where's your leaders on that? Where's your just website on that? Do you have an NIL person? Do you have any sort of NIL philosophy? Like, it took a long time for a lot of schools to even develop a policy. And so in that sense, when I can talk about those things and the people who are watching this and other fans and stuff can help me talk about those things effectively, that has shown itself to be really, really good just as recently as this offseason.
You mentioned the Illini Guardians and Josh Whitman, Brad Underwood, Brett Bielema have promoted those guys as an important part of their program moving forward. How has that relationship evolved, and how is an NIL collective? How does it impact what you guys do from an NIL perspective?
It's a great question, and I'm glad I'm going to get an opportunity to kind of speak on it. So I'll say, for folks who may not be aware, the Illini Guardians is a third-party entity created for the purpose of supporting finding Illini student-athletes through NIL. It's the only purpose of it. The people in it, know them personally, talk to them regularly. They don't earn compensation from that. They want to make sure that student-athletes have an opportunity to monetize their NIL rights and do service-related activities. That's basically what it's for. Having a third-party entity is going to be, and I would say is, if it's not already, is going to continue to be one of the most important aspects of a successful NIL approach. It just is. For folks who are here around Champaign who say, you know what would be great? My daughter is turning 15 this weekend. She loves basketball, and I want to help out with Coach Green and some of her new initiatives. I want to hire one of the women's basketball players to come to the birthday party. Great idea. We have alums all over the world, right? There are folks who are in Houston who love the Illini. There are folks in San Francisco who are listening to this podcast. There are people in Atlanta who are beating the drum and they want to help, but they don't live in a place where they can really interact directly with student athletes in that way. That's the value of the Illini Guardians, is you can say, okay, I'm going to give my $50 to this group and I can trust that group. And the reason you can trust the group is because of the relationship that group has shown a willingness to have with our athletic department. They are a third-party group, but we hope that we've been able to indicate that it's a group of folks that we are in regular communication with and that we trust and that we're able to kind of influence to some degree. So the group cares a lot about how they can help the University of Illinois' athletic programs. Like, that's really it. And then how they can, the only thing they care about other than that is how they can help the Illinois community. And so they never do anything that's kind of at odds with that. I'd say that one of the things as we change the state law is it allows me and our department to actually get more involved with having those discussions with the group, and allows them to ask more questions, and it allows them to kind of join more with what we're doing. And so I think you may have been referring to it earlier, Jeremy. I mean, recently is, a month ago, Coach Underwood, Coach Bielema, Josh Whitman all went over to Decatur and actually spoke at a Guardians event. It was, the Illini Guardians, they hosted it, they were the MCs, but the people who spoke at it were university employees and people who wanted to kind of show a level of solidarity and trust with that group. So I'd encourage people to get involved.
Kim, I want to go back to this. It's been a year of NIL. You said you could see things early about where this was going, and maybe then there were some surprising things. So the evolution of this, what has surprised you? What hasn't? What's gone the way you thought?
So one thing that hasn't, I'll kind of answer all that in one swoop.
That was way too many questions in one.
No. It's all related. So one thing that has not surprised me is that the foundation of NIL has been really donor support. And I mean that by, people whose names are on buildings, and I also mean that by people who just buy tickets. All of that, all those people are donors, fans, supporters of what we're doing here. The nature of institutional programming, be it, the College of Engineering or just a cool initiative, the study abroad initiative that comes out of the business school, all of that stuff is financed by alums, boosters, donors. That's how stuff happens on a college campus, right? So we don't have salary caps and drafts and other kind of principles of parity. That's how stuff happens. And so even early on, when so many of the headlines were about whoa, so-and-so signed a deal with this company and other people signed a deal with that company, I would be really, really interested in that stuff. And then I do a little bit more digging than other people did because it's my job. And often I'd see, well, that company is run by someone who supports the school, or well, that company is local to where the school is and is an institutional partner of the athletic department. It's a little bit different. And so the idea that what would eventually emerge out of that were just third-party entities solely dedicated to supporting student athletes through NIL, I wasn't that surprised by that. I didn't think that it would happen so quickly, and I didn't think it would happen in this form. But the idea that, you could have a company that hires a lot of student athletes if you actually own a company that operates and there's a value of doing that, like several people have across the country. Or if you don't have that, you could just form a company specifically for the purpose of working with student athletes through NIL. I wasn't terribly surprised by that. I mean, I think also with my kind of previous experience in corporate law, but specifically securities transactions and private equity fund formation, the idea that there would be a fund that exists kind of to serve the interests of another group, I wasn't that surprised. And that would be run by a small group of people. That's kind of how a lot of money moves around the economy. That kind of makes sense. So I wasn't surprised by that. But the idea that we'd be sitting here, a year into NIL and over half of the Power 5 schools would have a collective, I was surprised by that. I think I was also surprised by the activity in the portal. I mean, I don't love to see that. One, because again, the portal is not this kind of cure-all that it's sometimes seen to be. One, a significant number of student athletes going to the portal never come out, has a Bermuda Triangle element to it. I think also because when you really look at and take a deep dive on the portal, you'll see, specifically in the context of men's basketball, that a lot of times what folks are doing is they're moving kind of program tiers, right? And so a lot of times you don't know how it's going to translate. It's one thing if you're looking at Indiana and you're looking at Illinois, we've been historically kind of competitors. If you're looking at us and then you're looking at a school that may be a lot small, you don't really know how that's going to translate. And so there's been a lot of that kind of activity, and it's not necessarily solved all this stuff. I think I didn't necessarily appreciate the way that NIL and the portal might interact. I'm glad that there are people who are trying to kind of curtail that and trying to make that not the case. But that's something I really didn't see coming. But I look forward to kind of going into year 2 and getting a better sense of what will emerge now, because a lot of what will happen is that things that we want to work that didn't, those things will just go away. And there's a lot of infrastructure and time put on it, but it's a sunk cost. But then there will be new ideas. And I think I'm excited to see the emergence of some of the things where the groundwork has been laid. So things like the jersey program, eventually you'll see the video game. You'll see things where you'll be like, oh, folks were talking about that and signing up for those things for a long time, but they were so large scale that they took that time. And it'll be cool to kind of see that stuff come to light.
Obviously, Cam, we've had some high profile cases of some stars leaving schools to go to other schools where they get these huge NIL inducements. So has NIL, you talked about it with the transfer portal, both these things kind of happening at the same time, has it turned into pay for play? And if so, I know the NCAA is trying to kind of curtail on this. How does the NCAA, conferences, universities, how do they do anything about it?
So from my perspective, it hasn't turned into pay for play. I mean, I think there are very few student athletes who should be transferring exclusively because of what they think is going to happen in NIL. I love the fact that folks have transferred here and said, hey, look, NIL is a part of it. But remember, I listed 4 things earlier that should be a part of that discussion, and I think are a part of that discussion. But it's inevitable that there are people who are going to be bad actors out there who are going to be promising stuff. And in that situation, it does become just a roundabout way of pay for play. I think how to solve that problem, I don't entirely know. I think one of the things that's interesting is, considering what type of money you might make at an opportunity is what people do all the time. I mean, I'd say, even when you think about scholarships for some of our non-revenue sports and stuff, it's regularly made a decision as well. They gave me this much money for tennis and somebody else gave me less money. And that's different because it exists in a different context, but the theory is actually the same. I think that whether the NCAA will solve that has to do with what the NCAA's authority is, and that's changing every day a little bit. I mean, as we consider the NCAA working through its new constitution, as we consider kind of the conference structure, the autonomy structure, and all the things that kind of contribute to this time of intense disruption, there are probably 7 or 8 things that are happening simultaneously in college athletics, where if that had happened 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it would be the biggest thing that had happened in 10 or 15 years. I mean, I'll ask you, Jeremy, remember when Texas and Oklahoma said they were going to go to the SEC? It seemed like old news, right? Because there's all this other stuff that has happened. Or even remember the Alston case from the Supreme Court, right? There's just all this just stuff, and it gets forgotten about because there's other levels of conference realignment, because there's new media deals, because there's NIL, because there's a kind of, you don't have to sit out for the transfer portal. There's all this other stuff. That stuff kind of gets buried, and all of that, I think, gets considered because none of these issues exist in a vacuum as much as we would like for it to. Every issue that we kind of solve, every time we pull on one lever, it affects another lever. And so I think there will have to be some level of a holistic solution. I don't know that comes in a near term. I don't know what that looks like, and I don't know how it gets administered. But for now, I don't think that it can necessarily be solved by kind of the current NCAA, and definitely not in short order.
Kam, just a few more for you. There was an amendment to the Illinois state law that now allows you and the university to be involved in facilitating these NIL deals. I know you were a part of making that push, and so was Josh. So what's that look like now, and how's that impact everyone involved in this process?
It's really been great. It's really, really been great. I'd say one of the big things is it allows us to get more involved in arranging NIL transactions. And that's important practically, but also theoretically. What it really is a symbol that we're willing to kind of engage more with NIL transactions and insert ourselves in there. I mean, I think there are things that we think about from a bunch of different perspectives, and we say, well, kind of alluded to earlier, like, well, we're still not going to do this, or we still don't want to do that. But it's different than saying that we can't. When you can't, I think there's this tendency to say, well, that'll never happen, so I don't need to explore that. Now there's this sense of, well, it could happen, or we need to think about why we do or don't want to do something, or we need to think about a roundabout way of doing something. We need to think about how many resources we want to dedicate to doing something, as opposed to I just can't. So I think it's been really, really a breath of fresh air, because it has kind of just continued the juices of innovation and gotten them flowing and got us to think, okay, look, there's a lot that we can do here. So what do we want to do? And we still don't know the answer to all that stuff. And I'll tell you, neither does anybody else. But I like where we are. I like that we have given ourselves the free rein to do it. And I also like the fact that we're putting ourselves on a level playing field. You may have seen that just as recently as last week, Missouri signed their law. And that was kind of the last one that I was tracking them in Louisiana in terms of whose laws were kind of moving this direction and how to get there. So it's been really, really, really great, honestly.
Yeah, so basically you guys now can link people together, right? The student athletes and anybody interested. And before, you just kind of had to be like, oh, throw our hands up in the air, right? So how's that impacted the students?
Yeah, so the students love it. I mean, that's the thing is, and I said this before, there was an appetite, just to be clear about it. Not only can we get involved in these transactions and more kind of involved in arranging these transactions, there was an appetite from student athletes and the people who are in the market for student athlete celebrity for us to do so. So student athletes are happy. I mean, they want us to review their contracts and offer comments on it. They want us to be able to say, hey, you know who you should call And so do the people who want to use student athlete celebrity. If you own a business around here and you're thinking, I really want to work with a volleyball player because I know how important volleyball is to this community, and I might want to work with 2 or 3 volleyball players, but I don't know how to get in contact with them. It's important that I can say, well, you should probably call this person and that person because I know that they're interested in that particular type of product. Or, well, this person is local, and so it makes more sense. I mean, I had a conversation with somebody just yesterday on who was excited about kind of getting involved with NIL. And I said, look, I mean, because of where your business is, you should think about these 3 people or these other 3 people because they're tied to that place. And they're like, oh, I didn't even know that they were from here. Like one they did and the other 2 they didn't. And so I was like, oh yeah, but that's the kind of stuff that wouldn't have been able to happen before. And so they kind of were potentially missed out on a whole year's worth of NIL activity, because I bet you if I could have had that conversation this time last year, we would have been having that conversation. So it does allow us to play matchmaker a little bit, but it also allows us to play matchmaker effectively and to make the process a lot more efficient.
Well, Kam, it's nice to have a local NIL expert so we can come to you with these questions. But a bunch of you guys, Kam Cox is across the country, met in Atlanta for the NIL Summit. So I'm wondering, like, when you guys get together, what are you discussing about the future of NIL? Like, what are you thinking could be next, or what changes next in navigating this space?
Those are my favorite conversations. So those are all theory. And I'll tell you, they're like level 7 because it's all, when I'm in this kind of a setting, of course, a lot of it is educating people and getting people to understand what's actually happening. When you get around those conversations, well, we all kind of have a general sense of what's happening. So it starts to become what if I wanted to, or what do you all think you would say about, or do you think that we would run into issues from a university resource standpoint and then people will say, well, our general counsel said this, but I think that, and I'll be like, yeah, our general counsel said this other thing, but they didn't bring up this piece, but I bet you that this other person would. And so it's all that kind of idea.
Wonky stuff. I love it.
It really is wonky stuff, but that's how you can kind of push the envelope, because you think about it, there's a lot that is possible in the NIL space. But particularly as we think about being able to play matchmaker and get more involved in arranging this stuff, a lot of it has to do with what there's an appetite for. And a lot of times what happens is fans are very supportive of their team and their team's initiatives, and they're fanatical about that, but they're not as clued into what's going on across the country. And so there are times where I might see something out of California, or I might see something out of one of the schools in the Southwest and say, that would actually be really cool here, even if we might have to take a little bit of a different form. And so having that trust and saying, well, how did you do that? Or, well, why were they okay with this aspect that I think I might run into problems with? That stuff is very, very helpful. And so being able to just sit down in Atlanta with other people who are in the same seat as I am and kind of exchange ideas freely, that was really, really good.
Well, Kam, is there anything else about NIL that I haven't asked, or you want people to know about the process?
Not really about the process. I mean, look, there's kind of 2 things I'll say. You should totally get involved, and I will help you. Those are really the 2 things. I know it's new. I know it can seem overwhelming. I know there's all this stuff about it, but I'm more than happy to help you. I mean, my email is kcox@illinois.edu, so it should be really, really easy to find, really easy to remember. And you really should get involved, because this is what is moving the needle right now in college athletics. There's not anything in this moment at the end of June in 2022 that is more important to the success of our athletic department than folks' support in NIL, and that support has to come from you. I'll say, Coach Bielema loves to say, you may be the difference. And I love saying that too, because the truth is, if you can get one more guy to decide, what, let me take a look at NIL, or at Illinois because of NIL, or if you can get one more guy to say, what, I really like what we're having here. And even though there are 4 things I'm considering, one of them I may like more someplace else, but the other 3 are great here, and one of them is NIL, that really may be the difference. So in this moment, particularly right now, because of everything going on in college athletics, we are trying to make sure we have every competitive advantage that we could possibly have. This is a really, really important one. And so I encourage people to do their part and join in.
you said it, Cam, Austin case, transfer portal, NIL, college realignment. It's all happening, but this seems like one of the biggest ones. And we always appreciate your insights. Kam Cox, NIL coordinator at Illinois. Always appreciate the time and insight, man.
Thank you. I appreciate it and look forward to talking to you soon.